Welcome to your first recorded lecture. We're going to go ahead and review Notes Unit 8.9, Cold War Cuba. Now that you've broken down the objective and know what it is you'll be learning today, let's go ahead and get started. During this lecture, you're going to be required to fill in blanks. You're going to be required to answer some show you rock or check for understanding questions. You're also going to be required to visit some YouTube video links, which will be posted up on the whiteboard. Take some notes on those video links and then continue your notes. So let's get started with the first slide. Where has the Cold War conflict spread to? You're going to see a ton of blue bullet points pop up on the screen, and these blue bullet points are basically showing us all the areas in which this Cold War conflict took place. Go ahead and take a couple seconds to pause your video, copy down these terms that are in red, copy them on your map, and then you can go ahead and resume the video. All right, so now that you've gotten all of these areas annotated on your map, we can easily see, if we take a look at the map here, the Cold War starts off in Germany. We see it spreads to Greece and Turkey. The U.S. is going to try to use containment here, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan. We then learned about how it spread into China, Korea, Vietnam. Today, we're going to take a look at how it spreads into Cuba. Keep in mind that the Cold War also spread into space. If we take a look up here, there was a Cold War conflict in space, and there was also a conflict over who had the most weapons. So since we're zooming in on Cuba today, we have to kind of talk about what was happening in Cuba before the Cold War actually hit Cuba. If we take a look at our map here, we can see that Cuba is located in the Caribbean right here, very close to the United States. And so when the Cold War starts in Cuba, this is going to be a very scary event for the United States, because this is the first time during the Cold War where communism is so close. Communism had spread to other areas in the world, but it had been on the other side of the world, in Europe, in Asia, and outer space. And so this is really close to home. So there is a guy by the name of Fulgencio Batista. We can see him down here. He was a capitalist, and he was the leader of Cuba before the Cold War, and he was supported by the United States because he was a capitalist. Now, just like in Vietnam, the United States decided that having a dictator who was capitalist was better than having a communist who was democratic. And so even though Fulgencio Batista is a capitalist dictator, the United States will back him up because he is capitalist. They're going to kind of close their eyes to the fact that he is a dictator. A lot of the people in Cuba are not happy with Fulgencio Batista, and so a guy by the name of Fidel Castro, we can see him here, a guy by the name of Fidel Castro comes in and promises to overthrow Fulgencio Batista and completely change Cuba for the better. He is a communist, and so he is going to become public enemy number one for the United States. Now, when he starts his revolution in 1954, he is going to get a lot of support in this revolution, is going to be very easily able to overthrow Fulgencio Batista. Batista and his followers are forced to flee Cuba, so we see him exit the screen, and eventually Fidel Castro takes full control of Cuba, turns Cuba into a communist government, and ironically becomes a dictator. And so he had promised all these magnificent changes, but kind of turns into exactly what Fulgencio Batista had been, a dictator. Only difference is he's a communist dictator, whereas Fulgencio Batista was a capitalist dictator. Go ahead and pause your lecture video and visit the YouTube link provided at the front of this board. Once you visit this video link, watch the entire video and make sure that you jot down 3 bullet point notes on the video. All right, now that you just got to see that video on the Cuban Revolution of the 1950s, let's take a look at how the Cold War starts in Cuba. With Fidel Castro stepping in and being the new leader and making Cuba a communist country, we're going to see that he quickly allies himself with the USSR. The leader during this time period is going to be Nikita Khrushchev, and this tight communist bond between Cuba and the USSR is going to be a big scare for the United States. So Cold War in Cuba, the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. quickly deteriorates, quickly falls apart as soon as Cuba becomes a communist country. And three of the reasons why the U.S. decides to distance itself from Cuba and pretty much be upset with Cuba is because, one, Cuba is now a communist country. And this is the first time in history when communism has been so close to the United States, and the United States is not comfortable with this. Secondly, the United States has this fear called the domino theory. And the domino theory is this fear that if one country becomes communist, that communist country will then go and infect, kind of like a disease, infect all of the other countries nearby, and all of those countries will then fall to communism. If we take a look at this political cartoon right here, this shows a really nice job of that domino theory fear. This fear that if Europe fell to communism, Asia would eventually fall to communism, which the U.S. is trying to kind of hold back and not allow. And if Asia fell to communism, communism would spread to the rest of the world. Now, with Cuba becoming communist, the United States feared that the domino theory would now become a reality in South America, that South America would now get infected from Cuba's communism. To make matters worse, the United States did not like the fact that Cuba is receiving aid and support from the USSR, because this is a clear signal that the USSR and Cuba are now allied, communist allies, and that creates a problem for the United States. In order to utilize containment, the idea of stopping communism from spreading, the U.S. decides to place a trade embargo on Cuba. Now, a trade embargo is when one country refuses to trade with another, or when one country does not allow others to trade with the enemy. So in this trade embargo, the United States is basically going to say, Cuba, we are not going to trade with you, and we are not going to allow our allies to trade with you. If you take a look at this political cartoon down here, we can see Uncle Sam is kind of imaginarily sticking his arms out, blocking Cuba so that no one can trade with Cuba. If you were a U.S. ally and you traded with Cuba, you're breaking the trade embargo and would quickly find that the United States would no longer be your ally. So a lot of capitalist countries decided to follow the embargo and not trade with Cuba anymore. If Cuba is a small island nation and is no longer trading with as many countries as it used to, you can pretty much imagine the type of economic, social, political hardships the Cubans would now experience with a decrease in items that they're receiving from trade. As a result of this trade embargo and as a result of Cuba becoming a communist country, pretty much all diplomatic, all governmental relationships between Cuba and the United States come to a complete end. Let's take a look at how Cuba continues to be a problem for America. It's a big problem. Again, if we look at this map, we can see here that Cuba is very, very close to the Florida Peninsula, not very far away. I think it's like less than a 30-mile swim. And so this was a huge problem. Now, I want you to stop and pause the video and try to answer this question. The U.S. knew that having a communist Cuba was a danger to the U.S. Try to come up with 3 reasons why. Once you've paused the video and answered these questions, come back and let's go ahead and see if you got the same answers as I did. Alright, so 3 reasons why having a communist Cuba was a problem for the U.S. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, communism was way too close to the United States now. With communism so close, reason number 2, this was basically now an attacking launch pad for the USSR. The USSR could attack the U.S. during the Cold War from Cuba, only a couple, 30 miles or more away from the U.S. And finally, by Cuba becoming a communist country, this is kind of giving a little extra point on the scoreboard for the USSR. This extra little point in the Cold War really showed the U.S. that the USSR was gaining a huge advantage in the Cold War and could possibly win the Cold War. As a result of communism being too close to the United States, the president at the time, our president right here, John F. Kennedy, also known as JFK, he decides that he has to get rid of communism and that the only way to get rid of communism is to get rid of Fidel Castro. But there's a problem. If he tries to get rid of Fidel Castro in Cuba, the USSR can try to take away West Berlin from the United States. See, the Cuban problem is going on at the same exact time as the Berlin Wall problem. And so JFK knows if I go into Cuba and get rid of Castro, Khrushchev, the USSR leader, can go into Germany, put more pressure in Berlin, and use the Berlin Wall as a way to take away West Berlin from us. And that is a huge problem. The U.S. is not willing to lose West Berlin because then they would lose full control of Germany. And again, Germany is seen as a trophy country that is required in order to win the Cold War. JFK decides to go ahead and move forward with a secretive plan created by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, in order to handle the problem in Cuba. And this secretive plan is going to be called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Go ahead and pause the video here. Check your understanding by answering these 5 Show You Rock questions. Once you're done answering these questions, go ahead and restart your video lecture. I will not be going over the answers to these questions, but you can definitely check your answers by coming into office hours or by replaying the video. All right, now that we're done with the Show You Rock questions, let's really zoom in to the Bay of Pigs invasion. If we take a look at our map down here, we can see Cuba off the coast of Florida. Down here in this circled area of Cuba, this is an area known as the Bay of Pigs, and at this area known as the Bay of Pigs is where the United States will launch this top secret CIA mission. So the Bay of Pigs invasion was the U.S. plan to get rid of Fidel Castro without looking like they had been involved in his murder. So what happens? The CIA trained Cuban exiles. Exiles are people kicked out of a country or who flee a country. The CIA trained Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. A ton of these Cuban exiles were Batista supporters, meaning people who had not liked the fact that Fulgencio Batista had been overthrown by Fidel Castro. The purpose of the invasion was to get these capitalist Batista supporters, these exiles, get them into Cuba so that they could launch a revolution against Fidel Castro. Let's go ahead and see if you can think into the future and make some predictions. Go ahead and complete sentence starter 1 listed here before you move on and watch the video. Once you've answered this sentence starter, you can go ahead and pause this video lecture, check the front whiteboard for the YouTube video link, watch the Bay of Pigs invasion video, and then you'll come back to your prediction. All right, now that you've actually seen the Bay of Pigs invasion video, go ahead and jump back to this prediction slide and answer sentence starters 2 and 3. Let's see what you got. Was your prediction right? Was your prediction wrong? All right, now that you've gone ahead and completed the prediction side, let's take a look at the outcome of the Bay of Pigs invasion. What happened? So Castro knew that the attack was coming and was able to easily and quickly defeat those capitalist Batista exile supporters. Not only was he able to defeat them, he was also able to capture some of them alive and imprison them. The Bay of Pigs invasion literally was a failure, a total failure and embarrassment from the United States, and quickly became known as the perfect failure. Now, it became very obvious very quickly who had launched this Bay of Pigs invasion and who had trained the exiles. Since everyone knew it had been the United States, the USSR decided it needed to step in to protect its communist ally in the Caribbean. And so Cuba's communist ally, the USSR, immediately decides to not only send advisors to Cuba, Soviet advisors, but to also send weapons of mass destruction, weapons of nuclear force. The USSR believed if Cuba was not nuclearly armed against the United States would probably launch another Bay of Pigs invasion attempt, and that attempt could be successful, and that attempt would turn Cuba into a capitalist nation. The USSR cannot allow for that. This video is going to end shortly. However, we're not done with the lecture. So once this video ends, go ahead and allow the video to start up with segment number 2. Segment number 2 will take us through the rest of the lecture. Again, you're going to be filling in blanks, filling out prediction slides, and watching videos. I hope you enjoyed part 1. Let's go ahead and start part 2.